young girl feeds a homeless boy every day, offering him hope when the world turns a blind eye. Years later, fate takes an unexpected twist. She's in a car accident, and the doctor who saves her life is someone she never thought she'd see again. But when he sees her, tears fill his eyes. Their story is one of kindness, survival, and an unbreakable bond. What happens when the past and present collide? You won't believe the incredible reunion that awaits. Please share with me where you are while watching this video. Comments below, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any future. The cold Chicago wind bit through Sophie's jacket as she walked home from school. It was one of those early November afternoons where the sky felt heavy with the threat of rain, and the streets seemed to swallow the light. She quickened her pace, eager to escape the chill, but as she passed a familiar corner, something made her stop. There, sitting on the sidewalk, was a boy. His clothes were worn and ragged, his face covered by a shaggy mop of unkempt hair. His eyes, dark and tired, stared blankly ahead, watching the world pass him by. His body was hunched, trying to shield itself from the cold, but he didn't seem to care. He had the look of someone who had long given up on being seen. Sophie's heart lurched. She had seen him before on this very corner, but she had never really looked at him. Today, however, something about him caught her attention, pulling her in. She paused for a moment, unsure of why she felt the need to approach him. Her mother always told her not to speak to strangers, especially not those who looked like they didn't have a home. But Sophie couldn't walk away. She could feel his loneliness, like an echo calling out to her, urging her to reach out. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to him. The boy didn't acknowledge her, not at first. She stood for a moment watching him. He didn't move, didn't flinch at her presence. It was as though he couldn't even sense her. But Sophie was determined. "Hi," she said softly. The boy looked up, his gaze hesitant at first, then flickering with a faint surprise. His eyes were dark, but there was something else in them, something fragile, like a story untold. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. Sophie hesitated, feeling a bit unsure of herself. But then she held out the sandwich she had been eating. It wasn't much, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, half eaten, but it was something. "Would you like a piece?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowing. His eyes flickered to the sandwich, then back to her, as if unsure whether to trust her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded and took the offered half. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough and soft, as if he hadn't spoken in a while. Sophie smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest despite the cold. "I'm Sophie. What's your name?" "James," the boy replied, his voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of them said anything more. Sophie sat down beside him, crossing her legs on the cold pavement. She didn't know what to say, but something inside her told her to stay. James, too, seemed content in the silence. There was no rush, no expectation. "Are you hungry?" she asked after a few minutes. James nodded again, but his gaze never left the ground. Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out an apple she had forgotten about. "Here," she offered. He hesitated for a moment but took the apple from her, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. A shiver ran down Sophie's spine, but it wasn't from the cold. It was something else, something deeper, a feeling of connection, however brief. They sat there in quiet companionship, sharing moments without needing words. Sophie couldn't explain it, but she felt as though she had known this boy forever. He wasn't just some stranger. He was someone who needed her just as much as she needed him, in a way she couldn't yet put into words. As the sky darkened and the wind began to pick up, Sophie knew it was time to go. "I have to go home now," she said reluctantly, but she found it hard to leave. James looked up at her, his eyes still holding that faint spark of gratitude. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said, the words quiet but hopeful. "I'll be back," Sophie promised. She didn't know why, but she knew she would. As she walked away, her heart felt fuller than it had before. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew this was just the beginning of something special. Sophie returned the next afternoon just as she had promised. The weather had turned colder, but the promise of something warm in her chest pushed her through the biting wind. She approached the same street corner, hoping to find James again. Her heart raced as she scanned the familiar spot, and then, just as she had hoped, she saw him sitting there, in the same spot, with the same distant look in his eyes. Her footsteps quickened as she walked toward him. When he saw her approaching, a faint glimmer of recognition flickered in his eyes. Sophie smiled, relieved that she hadn't come all this way just to find him gone again. "Hi, James," she greeted him, her voice light but sincere. "Hi," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. He didn't get up, but he looked at her, something softer in his gaze this time. Sophie sat down beside him, the cold concrete biting into her legs, but she didn't mind. "I brought you something today," she said, digging into her bag. She pulled out a small bag of fruit slices and a granola bar. "I wasn't sure what you liked, but I thought you might want something sweet." James took the granola bar from her, his fingers brushing hers again. His eyes looked down at the food, then back up at Sophie, searching her face as though wondering if she meant it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Of course," Sophie replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm glad I found you today." From that moment on, it became their routine. Every afternoon after school, Sophie would stop by the corner to see James. She brought snacks, sometimes fruit, sometimes a sandwich, sometimes a small toy or a book. They didn't talk much at first. There was something comfortable about the silence they shared, the unspoken understanding between them. As the days passed, Sophie began to notice the little things. James always seemed to sit in the same spot, his eyes distant, but his posture relaxed whenever she showed up. She noticed his worn clothes, faded jeans with frayed hems, an oversized jacket that had seen better days. His shoes were falling apart, and his hair was long, messy, and unkempt. Sophie's heart ached every time she saw him like that, but she never said anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she focused on the things that made him smile, the simple pleasures that made his day a little brighter. She brought him a picture book one afternoon, and to her surprise, he eagerly flipped through the pages, pointing to the animals with a quiet enthusiasm. Sophie smiled to herself, realizing that for James, this was his escape, a small moment of joy amidst a life of hardship. One afternoon, as they sat together on the cold sidewalk, Sophie looked over at James, who was staring at the ground, lost in thought. "What's your dream, James?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but sincere. James looked up at her, his eyes uncertain, as though the question had caught him off guard. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I want my own house, a place where I don't have to worry about where I'm going to sleep. A real home, you know?" His voice was low, but there was a quiet determination in his words. Sophie nodded, her heart swelling with both empathy and sadness. "You will get there, James. I know you will," she said with a conviction she didn't quite understand herself. But she believed it. She believed in him. The days turned into weeks, and their connection deepened. Sophie began to look forward to these afternoons more than anything else. They didn't need to say much. The companionship they shared was enough. With each passing day, Sophie became more aware of how little it took to brighten James's world, and in turn, how much it meant to her to bring him that small bit of comfort. But, as much as they had become friends, Sophie knew there was so much she didn't know about him. He rarely talked about his past. He didn't speak of family, of how he ended up on the streets, or even what he wanted for his future beyond the dream of a home. And yet, Sophie felt this unspoken bond between them, a connection that transcended words. Sophie began to wonder what had happened to him. What had driven him to the streets? Where had his family gone? Was there anyone out there who missed him? But she never asked. She didn't want to push him, to bring up painful memories before he was ready to share them. Instead, she allowed the silence between them to speak, knowing that in time, James would tell her when he was ready. Every day after they shared their snacks and their quiet conversations, Sophie would stand up to leave. But each time, it was harder to walk away. There was something about James that tugged at her heart, something beyond his hardship, something she couldn't explain. "I'll see you tomorrow, James," she would say, smiling as she turned to walk away. Tomorrow, he would reply, his smile just as faint, but equally genuine. And so their days continued. Each one was a small ritual, a shared moment in time that Sophie cherished more than she could put into words. In the midst of the chaos and noise of the city, Sophie found solace in their connection, an unexpected friendship that filled a space in her heart she didn't even know was empty. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie's routine became a comfort, a certainty in her otherwise hectic life. Every afternoon she would walk to the same corner, finding James sitting quietly as usual, his worn shoes resting on the cold concrete, his eyes staring into the distance. They would talk, share stories, and laugh together, sometimes without saying a word. Sophie's heart swelled with affection for this boy who had become more than just a stranger on the streets. He was a friend, a person she couldn't imagine her days without. But then, one day, Sophie arrived at their usual meeting spot and James was not there. Her heart skipped a beat, a sudden pang of anxiety gripping her chest. At first, she thought maybe he had gotten there late, or perhaps he had gone to run an errand. She sat down on the cold pavement, her eyes scanning the crowd, hoping to catch sight of him. But the more she waited, the more the sinking feeling grew. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Sophie had waited for nearly an hour. She stood up and walked around the corner, peering down alleyways and looking across the street, her breath clouding in the chilly air. There was no sign of him. No one seemed to have seen him. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had something happened to him? Was he in trouble? But the longer she waited, the more the gnawing feeling of dread settled in. He was always here, every day, without fail. Where could he have gone? Sophie went back the next day, and the next. Each day she arrived at the corner, hopeful but still anxious, her heart sinking when she didn't see him. The routine that had once felt so comforting now felt like an empty echo. As the days stretched on, Sophie's worry grew into a quiet obsession. She asked people on the street. She checked the nearby shelters, but no one had seen him. By the end of the week, Sophie was desperate. She couldn't understand what had happened to him. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. There was no sign of James, no trace of where he could have gone. It felt like the world had swallowed him up. She began to question herself. Had she missed something? Had she said or done something that made him leave? She kept replaying their conversations, searching for any clue she might have missed, but everything seemed normal, even happy. There was no reason for him to disappear like this. Sophie's visits to the corner became more frequent, but they were no longer filled with anticipation or hope. Now, they were steeped in worry, a quiet kind of desperation. She found herself sitting there, staring at the spot where he used to sit, wishing for just one more moment with him. She missed him more than she cared to admit. Her thoughts began to spiral. Was he in danger? Was he hurt? Sophie had no way of knowing. She had never even asked for his last name, never thought to push further, always content with the little pieces of his life he shared. Now she wished she had learned more about him. She wished she had asked about his family, his past, what had led him to the streets. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of James. Sophie found herself walking the streets at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but the city was just as indifferent as it had been before. She thought about the shelter, the parks, any place where a homeless child might go, but nothing turned up. The longer he was gone, the heavier the void inside her became. She knew in her heart that James might not return, but she refused to accept it. She kept the hope alive, however faint, that he would appear one day, that he would walk around the corner with that quiet smile, and they would resume their quiet routine as if nothing had changed. The waiting, however, became harder each day. Sophie began to feel a pang of guilt, wondering if there had been something more she could have done for him. She had promised to help him, to make sure he had something to look forward to. Yet now, all she had were memories of those afternoons spent together, a hollow ache in her chest. Her teacher at school noticed the change in her. Sophie was quieter than usual, lost in thoughts that she couldn't escape. She wasn't sure why she was feeling this way. It wasn't like she'd known James for long after all, but the bond they'd shared, however brief, had been real, and now she was left to carry the weight of his absence. One day, as Sophie was walking home, she passed the street corner again. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the road, her eyes scanning the area for the familiar sight of James. But the corner was empty, as it had been for weeks. The feeling of loss washed over her again, overwhelming her like a tidal wave. It was a loss she didn't know how to deal with. Sophie wasn't sure if she would ever see James again. She wasn't even sure if he was okay, or if he was still out there somewhere. All she had were the memories of their brief time together, memories that now seemed to fade with every passing day. But Sophie knew one thing for certain: no matter what happened, she would never forget him. Sophie often found herself thinking about James, especially as the years passed. His face, though fading in her memory, still lingered in her heart like a soft echo. She never stopped wondering what had happened to him, or if he was all right. Despite all her searching, she had no answers. The street corner that once felt like a place of refuge now felt empty, hollow, and distant. As time went on, Sophie moved forward with her life, as children do. She entered high school and later graduated, all the while carrying with her the memory of that friendship. But it wasn't until she started college that Sophie truly began to understand the weight of those days spent on the corner, the kindness she'd shown, and how much it had shaped who she would become. She chose to study journalism, not by accident, but because of the passion she had for telling the stories that mattered. She had always been an idealist, someone who believed in the power of words to change the world. It felt natural to her, almost as though it was the path she was always meant to take. The more she learned about social justice, about the struggles of the invisible people in her city, the more Sophie felt driven to give a voice to those who, like James, had been forgotten by society. Sophie's time as a college student was marked by long nights spent researching and writing about issues close to her heart: homelessness, child abuse, and poverty. But despite her growing body of work and the success she found in journalism, there was always a gap in her life. She would often be at the office staring at a pile of articles on her desk, and suddenly her mind would wander back to James. The memories would flood her, the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the dreams of a better life. And in those moments of reflection, Sophie would wonder if she had done enough, if she had done enough for him. After college, Sophie's career took off. She became a rising star in the local news scene, known for her investigative reporting and her dedication to social causes. Her articles were heartfelt and raw, shining a light on the stories that others chose to ignore. Her work resonated with many, especially those who lived on the fringes of society: the homeless, the abandoned children, the forgotten ones who lived their lives in silence. But as she poured herself into her work, Sophie's personal life remained stagnant. There was an emptiness she couldn't fill, a sense of longing she couldn't escape. She tried to ignore it at first, pushing it down with the excitement of her new job and the fast pace of life. But it was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, someone, missing from her life. One evening, as Sophie sat at her desk, she came across an article in the local paper that caught her attention. It was a story about a shelter for homeless youth in the city. As she read, something about the story felt familiar, like a spark had been ignited deep within her. The article spoke of a boy who had been living on the streets for years and had recently been accepted into medical school. The boy's name, James Carter, sounded like the name of the friend she had lost all those years ago. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had to know. She had to find out if this was the same James she had once helped. She immediately contacted the shelter, requesting more information. But the connection was weak, and the details were few. All she knew was that James had been living on the streets for years and had recently turned his life around. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Could it really be him? Could the boy she had shared that brief magical friendship with all those years ago be the same person who had turned his life around and was now on the path to becoming a doctor? The idea consumed her, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. The next few days were a blur as Sophie tried to gather as much information as possible. She reached out to the shelter again, followed up with other organizations, and spent hours combing through old newspaper articles. But no matter how much she searched, she couldn't be sure. Still, the connection between James and this boy in the article felt undeniable. And so, Sophie made a decision. She would find James no matter the cost. She needed to know the truth, to see if the bond they had shared all those years ago could still be alive today. She had to know if he had really made it out of the darkness, just as he had dreamed. Sophie knew that this was more than just a story. It was a personal mission, a journey that had started on a street corner all those years ago and was now leading her back to the past, to the boy she had never forgotten. As Sophie set her sights on tracking down James, she couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. There was something larger at play here, something beyond fate, and it was drawing them together once more. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her heart skipped a beat whenever she thought of him. It was as if the universe had been waiting for this moment all along, and now the pieces were finally falling into place. Sophie was determined to find James, to see him again, and to discover what had become of the boy who had once captured her heart. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. The journey was about to begin again. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Sophie couldn't shake the thought of James. The article she had read haunted her, making it impossible to focus on anything else. She spent every free moment at her desk, poring over every piece of information she could find. Each new detail felt like a breadcrumb, leading her down a path that she couldn't quite follow, yet couldn't abandon. Determined to learn more, Sophie contacted the shelter directly, hoping for more information. The person on the other end of the phone was polite, but the details she provided were minimal. James Carter had been a part of their outreach program for several years, she said, but he had moved on to attend college and had recently been accepted into medical school. The shelter worker didn't know much more than that, but she assured Sophie that James had been a success story, one of the few to escape the grip of homelessness and make something of himself. Sophie's pulse quickened as she listened. This could be him. Could this be the same boy she had fed sandwiches to all those years ago? The same boy she had shared stories with? The connection seemed too strong to ignore. She couldn't believe it. The thought that James could have risen from the streets to become a doctor felt like a miracle, a story too good to be true. She needed to confirm it. She needed to see him. Sophie knew she couldn't let this slip away. That evening, Sophie decided to take matters into her own hands. She used her connections at the local news station to dig deeper. With her experience as a journalist, she knew how to track down information. She combed through old interviews, finding scraps of details about James's past that she could use. Everything pointed to him, but there was still no hard evidence, no definitive proof that the boy she had helped so many years ago was the same person now on his way to becoming a doctor. Days later, after several more calls and a meeting with one of the professors at the medical school, Sophie received a breakthrough. A man named Dr. Mitchell, one of the professors at the school where James had been accepted, had mentioned a James Carter in passing as one of his brightest students. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she scribbled down the name. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this was the same James, the boy who had once sat on a street corner dreaming of a better life. She couldn't help herself. She needed to know more, to see it for herself. Sophie arranged to meet Dr. Mitchell, the professor who had taken James under his wing, hoping that he could give her a glimpse into James's journey. She was nervous, unsure of what she might find, but she couldn't resist the pull. She had to know if the boy she remembered was truly the man who had overcome so much. As she sat in the professor's office, Sophie tried to focus, but her mind was spinning. Dr. Mitchell spoke of James with admiration, describing him as a student who had worked tirelessly to get where he was. His passion for helping others, particularly homeless children, was evident in every class he attended. Dr. Mitchell described how James had shared his story in class, recounting his difficult years living on the streets, and how, through sheer willpower, he had fought his way to a brighter future. James is one of the most inspiring students I've ever taught, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice filled with warmth and respect. He has a heart as big as his ambition. He wants to change the world, and I have no doubt that he will. Sophie sat quietly, her heart swelling with pride. This was the same boy she had shared a sandwich with, the one who had dreamed of a better life, now on the verge of making that dream a reality. Dr. Mitchell paused, studying Sophie's face. You seem to know him well, he said, a slight glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She didn't know how to explain the connection. She wasn't sure how much he would understand, but she knew, deep down, that she couldn't let this moment slip away. I think I might know him, Sophie said softly, her voice trembling. I met James when he was just a boy on the streets. I fed him lunch, shared some stories with him. I never forgot him. Her words were rushed, as though speaking them aloud made the truth feel more real. Dr. Mitchell's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. It's remarkable, he said. James never spoke much about his past to anyone. But if you were part of his life in that way, it makes sense. He's always talked about how certain people, kind people, changed the course of his life. Maybe you were one of those people, Sophie. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. This was more than she had ever imagined. To hear Dr. Mitchell confirm what she had always hoped, James had not only survived, but he had thrived, filled her with a bittersweet joy. As she left Dr. Mitchell's office, Sophie felt a sense of closure, but also a longing she couldn't ignore. She knew she had to see James again, to reconnect with the boy who had once been her friend, the boy who had inspired her to do what she did today. She didn't know how it would happen or when, but she was determined to find him. The mysterious connection between them, the one that had started on a cold Chicago street corner so many years ago, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Sophie couldn't shake the thoughts of James. After her meeting with Dr. Mitchell, she felt both a sense of accomplishment and a renewed sense of purpose. She was closer than ever to finding James, and the anticipation of reconnecting with him filled her with a strange excitement mixed with nervousness. Yet, as the days passed, she found herself thinking about how their story had unfolded, how a chance encounter had led them both down paths neither could have predicted. Her work had become more demanding. Stories piled up, deadlines loomed, and the weight of responsibility was constantly on her shoulders. But there were moments in between the rush of work when she allowed herself to think about the future, about what it would mean to finally see James again. It was one of those nights when Sophie felt the weight of it all. She had just filed her latest story and was driving home from the newsroom. The air was crisp, the kind of early winter chill that signaled snow was coming. The streets were slick, and the headlights of other cars shimmered through the fog that had begun to settle over the city. Sophie's thoughts wandered as she drove, the city's lights flashing by, her mind still on the connection she had just uncovered. James, she thought, I'm so close. Her fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the low hum of the car engine. The quiet night felt almost peaceful, but in the back of her mind there was still a tightness, an unease she couldn't quite shake. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car swerved across the lane, cutting right in front of her. Sophie barely had time to react. Her foot slammed down on the brake pedal, but the icy road was unforgiving. The car careened out of control, spinning, and Sophie's world turned into chaos in an instant. The car collided with the curb, the impact sending a sharp jolt through her body. The world around her became a blur of screeching metal and shattering glass. Sophie's breath was knocked out of her as the car spun, and in that fleeting moment, everything went dark. It was a long while before she heard anything again. The screeching of sirens, the distant shouts of voices, the ringing in her ears. But everything felt muffled, distant, as though she were floating in and out of consciousness. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind was foggy, and for a brief second, Sophie didn't even know where she was. The reality of the accident had yet to sink in. It was as if the world had slowed down, each second stretching longer than the one before. Then she heard voices. Familiar voices calling out her name. We've got a pulse, but she's not responding. Sophie tried to focus on the voices, tried to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding around her, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The only thing she could do was listen as the paramedics worked swiftly to stabilize her. A hand gripped hers, and Sophie wanted to squeeze back, but she couldn't. The weight of her body felt like it had been abandoned by her own mind. The next thing she remembered was the sensation of being lifted, the sting of the cold air against her skin as she was pulled from the wreckage, and the dim glow of the hospital lights coming into focus as she was rushed to the emergency room. Her vision was still blurry, and her thoughts were scattered, but the only thing she could focus on was a strange sense of déjà vu. Something about this felt eerily familiar. "Stay with us, Sophie," a voice called out, urgent but calm. The words sounded so far away. She couldn't respond, couldn't even open her eyes fully, but she heard them. She could feel the pressure of someone's hands on her, stabilizing her, guiding her through the haze. Sophie's heart raced with the panic of being trapped in her own body, unable to break free. She could feel the movement, the sensation of the gurney being wheeled down the hall, the hum of the hospital surrounding her. Everything was a blur. It wasn't until she heard the distant wail of the ambulance siren that the gravity of the situation truly settled in. She was alive, but for how long? She didn't know. The hospital was a whirlwind of activity. Nurses ran beside her, updating the doctor on her condition. Sophie was aware enough to understand the gravity of what was happening, but her thoughts were still clouded, her consciousness flickering in and out like a broken light bulb. She caught snatches of words: critical condition, injuries, emergency surgery. Then something else caught her attention. As they wheeled her into the operating room, one of the paramedics said something that made her heart stop. "We need Dr. Mitchell in here. She's critical." Sophie's mind snapped to attention. Dr. Mitchell? It was a name that struck her with a sense of recognition, a name that made everything feel more surreal. The professor, the man who had been guiding James. She couldn't make sense of it. Why was he here in this moment, in her moment of crisis? Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Sophie felt herself being prepped for surgery, the cold of the operating table beneath her, the sterile smell of the hospital overwhelming her senses. She wanted to reach out, to speak, to let them know she was still there, still alive. But all she could do was lie still, lost in the haze of drugs and fading consciousness. The last thing she heard before the darkness took over was a voice, low and steady. "We're going to save you, Sophie. I won't let you go." Sophie couldn't place it, but that voice felt so familiar, like a connection she had forgotten, one that had been waiting to be remembered. Sophie's world was a blur. The beeping of machines, the cold, sterile environment, and the harsh lights of the hospital room were all she could perceive. She felt disoriented, detached, as though she were floating just above her body, unable to fully connect with her own senses. The pain, when it finally pierced through the fog of unconsciousness, was sharp, almost unbearable. But the worst part was the silence that enveloped her, the silence that stretched between her fractured moments of awareness. Somewhere in the haze, Sophie heard the sound of footsteps, voices, distant but clear, urgent. A steady hand brushed against hers, holding it with care. And then, through the veil of confusion, she heard a name, her name. "Sophie, can you hear me?" The voice was calm, soothing, yet tinged with an edge of worry. Sophie tried to focus, but her mind felt as though it was made of fog. The voice continued, "Sophie, stay with us. We're going to take good care of you. Just hold on." It wasn't until she felt the pressure of someone's hand that she was truly aware. The warmth of it grounded her, pulling her back toward reality. It was the first thing she could truly feel in what seemed like an eternity. Then she heard another voice, a voice that made her pulse quicken with recognition. "Get her stabilized. I need a full report. Let's move fast," said a man. The voice was steady, authoritative, and Sophie's body responded to it without thinking. She was aware now, aware enough to sense the urgency in the air. But why did this voice feel so familiar? The man stepped closer, his face coming into view, although Sophie's vision was still blurry. He was a tall figure with sharp eyes and a demeanor that commanded attention. He leaned over her, checking her vitals, as if nothing in the world mattered except for getting her through this moment. Sophie tried to focus on his face, but her eyelids felt too heavy. She couldn't make sense of everything. The noise around her, the people moving quickly, the hands on her, the machines buzzing. Nothing made sense. And then, as she tried to understand it all, the realization hit her with a jolt, more powerful than the pain. "James?" Sophie's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she even said it aloud, or if it was just a desperate thought that escaped her lips. The man, the doctor, paused. Sophie's heart raced as she waited for a response, her mind spinning with disbelief. Was it really him? Was this truly the boy who had sat beside her on the cold streets so many years ago, sharing sandwiches and dreams? The doctor looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "Sophie." His voice wavered ever so slightly. "It's me. It's James." The world around Sophie seemed to shift. The steady hands she had once trusted as a child were now the hands of a doctor, a man who had risen from the streets, from the darkness of homelessness to save lives, to save her life. Her mind struggled to piece it all together. This couldn't be real. She must be imagining it, hallucinating in the haze of pain and confusion. But then she saw the faint glimmer in his eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with hope, even in the darkest moments of his life. Her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The gravity of the moment was too overwhelming. James, now Dr. Mitchell, had always been a mystery in her life, a fleeting presence, someone she had helped and then lost without a trace. And now, here he was standing above her, guiding her through this nightmare, making decisions about her life, decisions that felt more personal than professional. He was her savior, the one who had pulled her back from the brink, but he was also someone she had never truly expected to see again, especially not under these circumstances. As the medical team continued to work on her, James's focus never wavered. He was calm, precise, as though every moment counted. Sophie's life depended on him, and he knew it. Sophie's mind was still racing, trying to make sense of it all. The man who had once been a child on the street, the boy she had shared simple moments with, was now the doctor who held her life in his hands. James felt a knot in his stomach. He had never imagined this moment would come. He had never thought, as a young boy, that one day he would be saving the life of the girl who had saved him in ways that were beyond understanding. Sophie had been a light in his life, a symbol of kindness in a world that had given him nothing but hardship. She had offered him a piece of food, a bit of hope when he needed it most. And now, all these years later, he had the chance to return the favor. But despite the clinical focus, there was a part of him that was overwhelmed by the emotional weight of it all. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling slightly as he gave instructions to the team. "Sophie," he whispered again, his voice tight with emotion. "Stay with us. I'm not going to let you go." The moment felt surreal, the juxtaposition of his past and present colliding in a way he never could have anticipated. He had once been the lost boy on the street, the boy with nothing but dreams. Now, he was the one who had the power to help her. He couldn't help but think back to the little girl who had brought him that sandwich, that simple act of kindness that had set him on a path to something greater. The operation was a delicate one. Every second counted, and James knew it. As his team worked diligently around him, he focused on Sophie, on making sure she survived this. But there was a lingering thought in the back of his mind. What would have happened if I hadn't made it? If I hadn't found my way? Sophie's breathing remained shallow, but her vital signs stabilized, a small victory in the fight against time. James didn't allow himself to relax, not yet. But as the operation continued, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just saving her life, he was reconnecting with a part of himself he thought was lost forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgery ended. James's hands were still steady, despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. He gave the final instructions to the team, ensuring that everything was in place for Sophie's recovery. As the team began to clear the room, James lingered for a moment. He took one last look at Sophie, still unconscious on the table, and whispered, "I won't let you go, Sophie. I promise." The weight of his promise settled in his chest, and he knew, no matter what happened next, he would do whatever it took to make sure she woke up. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Sophie lay motionless, her body still healing from the trauma of the accident. The world outside seemed distant, as if it were happening far away, behind a foggy window. The lights of the hospital flickered softly, casting long shadows in the sterile room. But there was a feeling of anticipation in the air, a quiet tension that made everything feel suspended in time. James stood by her bedside, watching over her as she rested. His thoughts were a jumble, his emotions raw and unsettled. He had never imagined this day would come, never thought he would be standing here in this position, saving the life of the girl who had once saved him. But now, as Sophie lay unconscious in front of him, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their shared history bearing down on him. He had been through so much since the last time he saw her, years of hardship, survival, and ultimately triumph. He had fought for his future, for a chance to build a life that meant something. But none of it had been possible without the kindness Sophie had shown him as a boy, sitting on that street corner. It was that kindness, that small act of reaching out to someone in need, that had ignited the spark of hope he carried with him to this day. Now, as he watched over her, he wondered if Sophie remembered those moments they had shared. Did she recall the laughter, the quiet talks, the simple dreams they had woven together on that cold street corner? Did she remember the girl who had offered him a piece of sandwich, who had promised him a better life? James wasn't sure if Sophie would wake up, or when she would. He wasn't sure if their paths would cross again in the same way. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to be there for her, just as she had been there for him. This was his chance to return the favor, to make good on the promise he had made to himself all those years ago. The minutes dragged by, the silence in the room deepening as James remained by Sophie's side. He didn't leave. He couldn't. Not when she needed him most. He had seen the fear in her eyes when she had whispered his name earlier, and he knew that their connection had always been something deeper than mere coincidence. Sophie had been the one to help him find his way, to give him a reason to believe in himself again, and now it was his turn to help her, to be the one she could lean on. As the hours passed, James felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for Sophie's hand, holding it gently. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to be there when she woke up. He had to be the one to help her through this, to show her that she wasn't alone. They had been through too much together, too many years of uncertainty, of hardship, of loss, to let it all slip away now. Suddenly, a small movement caught his attention. Sophie's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, her gaze blurry at first. It took her a moment to focus, but when she did, she met his eyes. The world around them seemed to disappear as they locked eyes, as if no time had passed at all. For a moment, there was only silence. But in that silence, 1,000 emotions passed between them: relief, joy, fear, and gratitude. Sophie's lips parted, as though she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She blinked several times, as if trying to gather her thoughts, her gaze still fixed on James. "James?" she whispered, her voice raspy but familiar. The sound of his name on her lips brought a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared for. He felt a lump form in his throat, and for a brief moment he couldn't speak. "It's me," he replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's really me." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, as if trying to process what she was hearing. "James, how did I get here?" Her voice was shaky, as though she hadn't fully come to terms with what had happened. What happened to me?" James exhaled slowly, trying to find the words. "You were in a car accident," he explained, his hand gently squeezing hers. "You've been unconscious for a while, but you're okay now. You're going to be fine." Sophie's brows furrowed in confusion. "A car accident? I don't remember any of it." She looked around the room as if trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," James said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "You're safe now. You're with me." For a long moment, Sophie didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the answers she wasn't ready to ask. She seemed overwhelmed, unsure of what to say or what to feel. But James could see it in her eyes, the recognition, the spark of familiarity, the bond that had never truly faded. "I'm so glad you're awake," James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned forward slightly, his hand still holding hers. "You've been through so much, and I couldn't let you go." Sophie's eyes softened as she looked at him, her fingers trembling as she squeezed his hand in return. "James," she whispered again, this time more softly, as though savoring the sound of his name. "I never thought I'd see you again." James smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I never thought I'd be the one saving you," he said, his voice full of warmth. "But here we are." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the years between them settling in. It felt as if no time had passed at all. Their connection was as strong as it had ever been, if not stronger. They had both grown, changed, and endured different lives. But at this moment, they were simply two people who had found their way back to each other. Sophie, still processing everything, smiled weakly. You've become a doctor?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. James nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah, I guess you could say I've come a long way." Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. The boy she had once shared sandwiches with was now the man who had saved her life. It was a story that felt like a dream she never wanted to wake up from. As they sat together, their hands still intertwined, Sophie knew that this was just the beginning. Their paths had crossed again for a reason, and this time, they wouldn't let each other go. The days following Sophie's awakening were a blur of recovery and rediscovery. Her body was still bruised, her bones aching from the accident, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional whirlwind she felt inside. James was always by her side, steadfast and calm, a constant presence in her healing journey. He never left her alone, even when she begged him to take a break or focus on his own work. For James, there was no question of where he belonged. He had found his place beside Sophie, just as he had all those years ago when he was a child with nothing, and she had been the one to offer him kindness. Sophie often found herself staring at James, trying to comprehend how their lives had intersected once more. He was no longer the boy she had met on the street, the one who had needed her simple acts of kindness. He was now a man, a doctor, someone who had overcome so much. But despite all the changes, despite the years that had passed, something about him remained unchanged. There was still that same quiet strength in his eyes, that same warmth in his smile. The hospital room was quiet in the early mornings, when Sophie would wake up, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, unsure of how to move forward. But every time she opened her eyes, James was there, sitting in the chair by her bed, a steady presence in the storm of her thoughts. He would smile softly, telling her that everything would be okay, even when Sophie didn't believe it herself. As her days in the hospital stretched on, Sophie began to realize just how much James had become a part of her life again. It wasn't just that he had saved her life. It was that he had helped her see the value in herself again. He had given her the courage to face her own fears and to understand that healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul, too. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky outside turned a soft shade of pink, Sophie sat up in her hospital bed, a little stronger than the day before. She looked at James, who was sitting next to her, his hand resting gently on hers. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again, even if just for a moment. "I've been thinking a lot," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the accident. "About us, about everything." James turned to her, his expression soft, patient. "What about it?" "I don't know how to explain it," Sophie continued, looking out the window as the light faded. "But I feel like everything that's happened, the accident, the hospital, all of it, has brought me to this point where I need to face what's been missing in my life. I've been running away from things for a long time, from what happened to me, from my own fears. And you've always been there, even when I didn't know it." James listened intently, his gaze never leaving her. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. He simply waited for her to find the words, as he had done so many years ago. He knew that whatever Sophie was going through, she needed to face it on her own terms, and he would be there, quietly, without pushing her to speak before she was ready. "You were my light when I needed it most," Sophie whispered, finally meeting his eyes. "And I never got the chance to thank you for that, for being there when no one else was, for showing me that there's more to life than just surviving. I don't know if I would have made it without you." James felt his heart swell at her words, the emotion he had been holding back threatening to spill over. He leaned closer, his hand gently squeezing hers. "You didn't need to thank me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the strength to believe in myself. You were the first person who saw me, really saw me, when everyone else turned away. That's something I'll never forget." Sophie's eyes softened, and she could see the vulnerability in his gaze. The same vulnerability that had once made her want to protect him. The same vulnerability that was still there, hidden beneath his confident exterior. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm, as if memorizing the feel of him. "We've both been through so much," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I think together we can heal. Together we can move forward." James nodded, his throat tight. "Together," he repeated, his voice steady but filled with a depth of emotion that only they understood. He knew what it meant, to be there for each other, to support each other through the darkest of times. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about growing, about being there for one another in ways that were real and lasting. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie's strength grew with each passing moment. She was no longer the fragile woman who had been wheeled into the hospital in critical condition. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more whole, and she knew that she owed it to James, to the quiet support he had given her, to the unconditional love he had shown. As Sophie prepared to leave the hospital, she found herself standing at the doorway looking back at James, who had been there every step of the way. He was the reason she could walk out of this hospital room, the reason she could face the world again. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Sophie knew that with James by her side, she could face anything. "I'm ready," she said, her voice clear and sure, the uncertainty gone. "Let's go home." James stood beside her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm right here," he said, his voice steady and full of promise. And together, they walked out of the hospital, ready to face whatever came next. Their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days after Sophie left the hospital felt like a new beginning. The world outside seemed brighter, as though the sun was shining just a little bit more for her, for both of them. The weight of the accident, the pain, and the uncertainty of her recovery slowly faded into the background, replaced by something deeper, something more powerful, hope. With James by her side, Sophie knew she was capable of facing anything. He had been there for her in ways she never expected, offering not just his medical expertise, but his heart. Their connection was undeniable, like a thread woven through their lives, tying them together in a way that felt destined, even if neither had fully understood it at first. Their days became a blend of quiet mornings and long talks, filled with laughter and sometimes tears. Sophie was no longer just recovering physically, she was healing emotionally too. Every conversation with James helped her confront her past, the fears and insecurities she had carried with her for so long. And in return, Sophie found herself offering James something he had never known before: peace. A kind of calm that came from knowing he wasn't alone, knowing that the choices he had made, the path he had walked, had led him to this moment. They spent hours walking through the city, talking about everything and nothing. James showed her the places he had visited, the neighborhoods he had lived in before he found his way to medical school, and Sophie in turn shared the stories of her life, her childhood, her struggles, her dreams. Slowly but surely the layers of their pasts unfolded, revealing the depths of their shared connection. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street near the park, Sophie looked at James, her heart full. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. James glanced over at her, his eyes reflecting the streetlights. I think about it every day, he replied. But I always thought the future was something I had to build alone. Now, his voice trailed off for a moment as if unsure of what to say next. Now, I think I can see a future where we're together, where we build it together. Sophie smiled, the warmth of his words filling her. I never thought about the future much before, she admitted, her fingers brushing against his. I was always so caught up in just getting through the day. But now with you, I feel like I could finally start planning for something bigger, something that's mine, something we can share. They stopped walking and stood there in the middle of the street beneath the glow of the streetlights. Sophie turned to face James, her heart beating a little faster as she spoke. I want to build something with you, James. I want to see where this goes. I want to share my life with you, the way you've shared yours with me. James reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. I've always wanted that too, he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. I want to build a future with you, together. And I know we've been through a lot, but I believe we can get through anything. We can create something beautiful. Sophie's heart swelled with emotion as she looked into his eyes, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't known she was missing. She had never been one to think too far ahead, but with James she felt as though anything was possible. Their bond was more than just a shared history. It was a promise, a commitment to each other, to a future they would create together, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, as Sophie continued her recovery and James kept up with his work at the hospital, they found themselves building a life that felt full, even in its simplicity. They spent evenings at local cafes, weekends exploring the city, and quiet nights at home talking about everything and nothing. Sophie had never known such peace, such contentment. She was healing, but more than that, she was growing, becoming the woman she had always wanted to be, with James by her side. They began making plans for the future. Little things at first, like picking out furniture for their apartment, talking about their careers, and discussing where they wanted to travel. But each conversation held more weight than the last, as they began to build something real, something lasting. One evening, after a long day, Sophie sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her as she read through a book. James was beside her as always, his presence comforting and familiar. She put the book down for a moment, looking at him with a smile that spoke volumes. Do you ever think about kids? She asked, her voice light but filled with curiosity. James turned to look at her, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I think about it sometimes, he said. I used to wonder what my future would look like. But now I see it with you, and it feels right. It feels like we're meant to build a family, if that's something you want too. Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had never imagined a future that included children, not after everything she had been through, but now with James the idea seemed possible, even beautiful. I think I do, she said softly. I think I want to build a family with you. James's eyes softened, and he reached for her hand. Then we will, he said, his voice filled with certainty. We'll build everything together. The conversation lingered between them, a quiet promise of what was to come. They were no longer just two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by chance. They were building something together, something stronger than they had ever known. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her heart. She had never known what true partnership could be like, but now, with James, she could see it clearly. They were ready for whatever came next. As they sat there together, Sophie knew that they had already built something beautiful, and that was just the beginning. Sophie and James stood together on the balcony of their new apartment, watching the city as it buzzed with life below them. The evening sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, a quiet calm settling over the city after the day's hustle. It was a moment of peace, the kind they had both been craving after everything they had endured. The past few months had been transformative for them both. After Sophie's recovery, they moved into a new place, one that was theirs, a home they could build together. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They spent hours decorating, picking out little things to make the apartment feel like it was truly their own. Each piece they added, each new corner filled with memories, brought them closer, weaving a tapestry of shared moments. It had been a long road, one filled with both light and darkness, but here they were, standing side by side, looking at the future. Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She had come so far, and so had James. "You know," Sophie said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "I never thought I'd be here in this moment with you." James turned to look at her, his eyes soft. "I didn't either," he said, "but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." There was a quiet weight in his words, something more than just the present. It was the acknowledgement of their shared journey, the years they had spent apart, the paths they had walked before they had found their way back to each other. It had all led to this moment, and neither of them took it for granted. Sophie smiled, her fingers reaching for James's. "It's funny," she said softly. "I used to think that the future was something you had to fight for, that you had to struggle to make it your own. But with you, it feels like it's already here, like we've already built it together." James squeezed her hand, his heart swelling at her words. "That's because we have," he said. "We've been building this future all along, even when we didn't know it. I think we've always been meant to find each other again. We just needed to go through everything we did to get to this point." Sophie nodded, her mind reflecting on everything they had been through. From the street corner to the hospital room, from the pain of loss to the joy of rediscovery, their journey had shaped them into the people they were today. They had learned to trust each other, to believe in each other, and most importantly, to believe in themselves. As she looked at him, Sophie realized how much she had changed. She had been a different person when they first met, shy, unsure of herself, running from the past. But with James, she had learned to embrace her own strength, to face her fears and move forward with purpose. "I'm ready, James," she said quietly, her voice filled with certainty. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, for the future we're going to build, together." James's eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Me too," he whispered. "There's no one I'd rather face the future with." And in that moment, Sophie felt a quiet peace settle in her heart. She knew that no matter what challenges they might face, no matter what obstacles would arise, they would face it together. Their journey had brought them to this point, and their future was theirs to shape. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about now, and everything they could accomplish together. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophie realized that this was the true beginning of everything. Not just the start of their new life together, but the start of something bigger, something that would carry them forward no matter what the world threw at them. Sophie had always believed in the power of second chances, in the idea that no matter how dark life could get, there was always a way back to the light. And now, with James by her side, she had all the hope she needed to face the unknown. In a world that often felt uncertain, their love was the one thing she knew for sure. It was the anchor, the foundation that everything else could be built upon. They had both come so far, and their journey was far from over. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next, hand in hand. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Sophie smiled up at James, her heart full. "We've got this," she said, her voice steady and full of hope. James smiled back, his eyes reflecting the same quiet confidence. "Yeah," he said softly, "we do." And for the first time in a long time, Sophie knew that no matter what the future held, she would never have to face it alone. Sophie and James had come a long way from the uncertain, turbulent days that had first brought them together. Their journey had been filled with pain, fear, and unexpected twists, but they had made it through stronger than ever. Each day they built more than just a life together. They built a shared future, one step at a time, learning to trust, to love, and to dream together. Now, standing on the brink of a life they had both imagined for years, Sophie could feel the weight of everything that had led them here. They had both faced the harsh realities of life, but they had also discovered something even more powerful. the unwavering strength of love, a love that had endured years of separation, obstacles, and challenges, but still managed to flourish, bringing them back together when it mattered most. It was a Saturday morning, and the sun was bright, spilling through the windows of their cozy apartment. The warmth of the sunlight seemed to echo the warmth in Sophie's chest, a feeling she hadn't known in a long time. She looked over at James, who was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up as she walked over, a soft smile spreading across his face. "You're up early," he remarked, setting the paper down. "How are you feeling today?" Sophie smiled, leaning against the counter. "Better than ever," she said, her voice light but filled with sincerity. "It's like every day feels a little brighter now with you by my side." James stood up, crossing over to where Sophie stood. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "I know what you mean," he said, his voice tender. "We've been through so much, but I truly believe this is just the beginning. We've got so much ahead of us, and I can't imagine doing it with anyone else." Sophie's heart fluttered as she looked at him. It was moments like this, moments where the world seemed to fade away, and it was just the two of them that made everything they had been through worth it. The pain, the loss, the uncertainty. It had all led them to this place, to this very moment of peace and promise. She had learned that true happiness didn't come from avoiding life's difficulties, but from having someone by your side to face them with. "I can't believe how far we've come," Sophie said, her voice full of emotion. "From the moment we met, I never imagined this, never imagined we'd be here living this life, planning our future together." James's thumb gently brushed against her cheek, a small but meaningful gesture. "I never thought I'd get the chance to have this," he said softly, his voice low and sincere. "But I've always known that when I found the right person, it would be worth every struggle, every challenge. You're my person, Sophie. And now we get to share this life, this love, together." Tears pricked at the corners of Sophie's eyes as she took a deep breath. The truth of his words settled deep within her heart. She had spent so many years alone, carrying the weight of her past. But now with James, she felt truly seen, truly understood. They were a team, facing the world together, no longer burdened by the past but inspired by the future. A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. James smiled and walked over to answer it, opening the door to reveal their neighbor, an older woman who had become a good friend since they moved into the building. "Good morning, you two," Mrs. Harper greeted them warmly. "I brought you both some fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. Figured you might like a little treat this morning." Sophie laughed as she walked over to join them. "You're too kind, Mrs. Harper." "Thank you." Mrs. Harper handed them a basket filled with warm, flaky croissants and sweet pastries, her eyes twinkling with affection. "You two deserve all the happiness in the world," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "I've seen how much you've been through, and it's so wonderful to see you both so happy." Sophie smiled, her heart full. It wasn't just James that had become her world. It was the community they had built around them, the people who had supported them, who had seen them grow, who had been a part of their journey. They were no longer just two individuals fighting to survive. They were a couple, a family, building a life of love and connection. As the morning passed, Sophie and James sat together in their cozy living room, sipping coffee and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. They talked about their future, plans for travel, for family, for a life filled with shared dreams. Sophie realized that everything they had endured, everything they had overcome, had led them to this peaceful moment of contentment. And this moment, she knew, was just the beginning. "You know," James said, looking over at her with a smile, "I think we're going to be just fine." Sophie's heart swelled at his words, and she nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think we are too," she replied, leaning in to kiss him. They were no longer just survivors of their pasts. They were architects of their future, building a life together, hand in hand. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie could say with certainty that she had everything she needed. They had built their happily ever after, not by escaping the pain of life, but by facing it together, finding strength in each other and the love they had nurtured step by step. And that was more than enough.